in the open for crowds and congestion. Why? When for most people, life became tougher. Once cities appeared, there was no going back. We're still paying the price in the sins of the city. I'm Kara Cooney, an Egyptologist on a worldwide quest. I look at human behavior, both past and present, through the lens of ancient Egypt. And the more I travel the world, the more similarities I see. Exploring why we are who we are often leads me out of Egypt. This is the modern-day city of Luxor. As with the rest of the world, the majority of Egypt's population lives in crowded cities like this.
But it wasn't always this way. Not long before the ancient Egyptians began building their greatest monuments ever, the very concept of a city would have been unheard of.
Cities are a relatively recent invention. Humans had always been hunter-gatherers, living in small, mobile family groups. They had few possessions. They moved with the seasons, tracked game, and foraged for fruit and vegetables. But today, more than half the world's population lives in congested urban centers. So when and why did cities start? What conditions led populations to settle down and build up? It didn't happen all of a sudden. The first step was agriculture. Successful farming meant staying in one place. Farming also produced a real surplus of food for the first time in history. Extra food meant that while the farmers farmed, some people could do other things. It looks idyllic, but even in Egypt, where the Nile soil is so rich, farming is a difficult life.
In many ways, it was easier for early people to be mobile, to follow the migrations of the animals they hunted, and to forage for vegetables and plants in the wild. As natural as it seems to us to grow our own food, settling down into farms and into cities was a radical move in human history.
It's called the Neolithic Revolution, the period in human history when people were tied to the land for the first time. And when that happened, everything about human society changed. Egypt has some of the oldest evidence of farming on Earth, in a place called the Fayoum, about 80 miles southwest of Cairo. Much of the Fayoum borders the Nile River. It's fertile land, ideal for farming. But over the millennia, the Nile has shifted its course. Land that in ancient times was nourished by the river and a huge lake is now barren desert. It's in one of these arid regions where my colleague, Willeke Ventrich, has recently unearthed evidence of an ancient farming community dating to 5500 BCE, 3,000 years before the first pyramids were built.
Is it fair to say that these trenches represent the first settlement in Egypt, the first evidence of settlement, or do we have earlier settlements?
There may have been earlier settlements, but we haven't found them. So this is really the earliest evidence that we have for settlements. And it's not a settlement as you would expect with streets and houses.
Willeke's team studies layers of material deposited by people over time. It's called stratigraphy. Dark layers of ash reveal that the ancient settlers built fires in permanent hearths. This tells us that people lived on this spot for decades, something they could only do if they had control over their food source. And the only way to have had that control was to raise crops and animals instead of hunting and gathering.
They're not only doing wheat and barley, so agriculture, but they also have sheep, their goats, their pigs. We found a lot of pig as well. The funny thing about pigs is that they don't like to walk. So pigs tend to point at settled living.
So why did these ancient people choose to settle down, plant crops, and build a community. Maybe changes in the climate made farming possible. Or perhaps farming became necessary to feed more people. Or maybe some people figured out that growing and controlling food gave them power over others. It's hard to say exactly what caused the human leap to agriculture, but whatever inspired it, this farming settlement appears to have been occupied for 500 years. So life must have been good.
It's easy if you know where your resources are. So you have one spot and from there you can go and you know where to find stuff. You have this wonderful lake which is plentiful of fish. So you have a well-balanced way of living.
This site is the earliest farming village ever found in Egypt. But in other parts of the world, the move to settle down began thousands of years earlier.
In central Turkey, a massive protective structure has been erected over one of the world's most important archaeological digs and the largest Neolithic site ever found, the settlement of Çatalhöyük.
People began to settle here almost 2,000 years before the first farmers appeared along the Nile. Çatalhöyük was first discovered in the late 1950s. Archaeologist Karis Eklund has agreed to take me through this remarkable site.
There's tons of layers here. This place was occupied for a while. Do you guys know how long?
Yeah, it was occupied continuously for about 1,400 years. They first settled here in 7400 BCE, and they abandoned the site about 6000 BCE.
And how many people are we talking about?
Population estimates vary between 3,000 to 8,000 people, and it probably changed over time.
So the site is not only older, but much, much bigger than the Fayum site in Egypt. This is one of the world's very first cities. The homes at Çatalhöyük were built from mud brick or adobe in rectangular shapes. Wooden posts supported roofs made from packed mud and reeds. Each building had 1, 2, or 3 rooms separated by thinner walls.
We look at a place like this, people living in 4 walls, and it seems completely normal. But in a way, this is absolutely radical for people who used to be free and mobile, moving about the countryside, to cramp themselves into this kind of a living space.
Yeah, and the houses that they lived in here, too, are a lot different than the houses that we live in today. They're much smaller, for one thing. There's actually no room in between the walls of the houses. They built their homes so close together, sometimes they shared walls, sometimes they're only centimeters apart, so that there were no streets. And we think that they moved about on the rooftops and descended into homes through holes in the ceilings.
Homes probably accommodated 8 to 10 people each and were clustered next to each other like a honeycomb. Archaeologists have unearthed 18 layers of construction at Çatalhöyük, a depth of nearly 7 stories.
The average lifespan of a building was about 80 years. And when people were ready to abandon a building, they went through a very special process. They first cleaned the whole house. They scrubbed the floors, they scrubbed the walls, they dismantled the roof, took out the posts, and they collapsed the upper halves of the walls. Then they very carefully filled in the rest of the building with dirt, and they built the next house directly on top.
Archaeologists here have found 4 houses directly aligned over an earlier one, with the walls, ovens, and hearths in exactly the same place. So in this ancient city, there's a remarkable continuity over time. There are several theories about who lived at Çatalhöyük. Some archaeologists think they were all farmers who worked the rich floodplain surrounding the city. But others think at least some of the residents may have been free to pursue other occupations because there was plenty of surplus food.
During the summers, we think that a lot of the daily activity probably took place on the rooftops. So we have evidence, especially in later levels, that they would move the ovens up to the rooftops. And so In that sense, it would have been like this huge marketplace on the roofs, and they might have been at different levels as well, and you've got people climbing up and going down.
So everyone would have been camped out on the roof and hanging out?
We suspect, but during the winter times, they probably spent most of their time indoors. If you think about all of the functions of a modern town, churches, cemeteries, industrial zones or factories, residences, at Çatalhöyük, what we see is all of those places brought into one place, into the home. They're burying their dead underneath the floors. They're cooking and eating and living in the main room.
So everybody's living their own discrete life packed into this town.
Yeah, but at the same time, of course, you have this balance because you're also living in a community with 5,000 other people.
For the residents of Çatalhöyük, this dense lifestyle brought dramatic new challenges, like how to cope with human waste, filth, and disease. At Çatalhöyük in Turkey, archaeologists have been working for years to excavate these Neolithic houses, some of them over 9,000 years old. They've reconstructed one of the ancient homes, and they call it the experimental house.
Go down, Paris.
It gives us a glimpse of what life was like in one of the world's very first cities.
We've got the entrance hole here. People would have come down on a ladder or some sort of stairs. We've got the oven directly underneath the door to let the smoke out, and the door really would have been the only source of ventilation or light because we don't have any evidence of windows.
And it's not that dark, it's pretty bright. When you whitewash all of this, it reflects off of here and it creates a bright room.
Houses like this contained heavy grindstones, a clear indication that the people depended on grains and beans for food, foods that needed to be processed before they could be eaten.
One interesting thing about the diet is that each house had its own storage capacity, so they were storing their own food and they were preparing their own food.
You need big grinding materials like this to actually be able to eat the food. So these people can't just pick up and go. They'd have to move all of this material, and you can't take this with you. This is a movable property.
Yeah, they're definitely committed to staying here. And we see that particularly in the artwork, too.
This is a replica of an original.
Yeah, this is a replica of a painting. It's been interpreted in different ways. Some say that this here is a volcano. It's called Hasan Dağ, and on clear days you can see it from the site. Some people think that it's the eruption of a volcano, and that these blocks here represent the houses of Çatalhöyük. An alternate interpretation is that this is a leopard skin, because we know that leopards were very important.
Life in Çatalhöyük appears to have been efficient and reliable. These ancient people clearly had worked out how to successfully stay in one place in close proximity over time. But with the first dense human settlements in history came a number of unintended consequences.
With a population of 5,000 living in the same space year after year, never moving to a cleaner location, hygiene was bound to suffer. And although it's hard to see in the skeletal remains, infectious diseases and parasites like tapeworms and lice were probably rampant.
The move to city life was a slippery slope.
So what about trash? How did they deal with it here?
So they actually threw away their trash on site. There were some spaces in between the buildings that we now call midden areas, or trash refuse areas. This is where they disposed of all of their domestic waste, the human waste.
It must have been really smelly. It must have been.
It probably was, and we wonder about that. It's probably smelled. It probably attracted flies. Mice probably lived in the little spaces in between the buildings.
When you consider the downsides, like infections, disease, and vermin, life in the crowded and cramped conditions of Çatalhöyük hardly seems like a step forward.
So what was life like before the Neolithic Revolution, before permanent settlements? One way to understand is to find a culture that still follows a hunter-gatherer existence.
There are very few of these people left, and most of them live in remote, inaccessible places. But fortunately, there are people with a living memory of this lifestyle, much closer to home. The state of Oregon is where the Plateau tribes live, the Umatilla, the Cayuse, and the Walla Walla. these Native Americans still practice hunting and gathering. Although they live in permanent towns and cities most of the time, for several weeks each year, in the spring and fall, they leave the urban world behind and return to the mobile lifestyle of their ancestors. Brian Connor and Ken Hall are tribal hunters.
Why do people of tribal descent still try to live in the old ways as a hunter-gatherer?
If you can have one person behind that can still speak the language, still knows how to hunt and gather, still knows the customs, out of maybe 100, if you have one person there that can still do that, then it's alive.
Bobby Connor is director of the Tribal Cultural Institute, where she teaches the old ways to new generations.
Now, the Plateau tribes have been in this area, you think, for about 10,000 years?
At least 10,000 years.
And they never lived in cities. They always lived in smaller settlements?
We lived in villages along rivers and canyons and sheltered areas in the winter especially, and then migrated to various locations of our food sources as the seasons changed.
Migrating to resources meant traveling light, especially when it came to shelters. Marjorie Waheneka has been hunting and gathering since she was a child.
One of the words that always comes to mind out of people is nomadic. It's correct in a way, but not really, because we weren't just traveling around. We had purpose with the traveling.
It's more migratory.
Yes, it was more, there was a purpose of food gathering.
The perfect shelter for this mobile lifestyle was the teepee. The Plateau tribes usually traveled in family groups of about 25 people.
Clever.
The women of the tribes were responsible for building the teepees.
Right there.
You guys make this look so easy.
Each teepee housed 5 or 6 family members. Experienced builders can erect a teepee in about 20 minutes.
That was my best one so far. That was good. How high do I have to go?
All the way up.
Sometimes the girls could actually shimmy, up there.
Or stand on each other's shoulders. I think she's needing a chair.
I need a chair. It's the first time I've ever said that in my whole life. But I'm not tall enough. Come on, there you are. Yay. Marjorie, this didn't take that long to put together. And I'm just thinking of how this compares to city life when everyone's all crammed together into these permanent structures. This wouldn't have been a bad way to live at all.
No, it wouldn't. And we're always outside. We were always active.
So you're hunting, you're gathering, you're riding horses, you're camping every now and then in teepees like this. It's a very healthy lifestyle.
Very healthy. It wasn't until the non-Indian came in that we started developing all of these diseases, all of these things that restricted the length of our life.
The new diseases restricted more than just the length of the Indians' lives. The movement of white settlers into the West almost destroyed a whole way of life. The newcomers wanted land, and they wanted to own it.
Now, as farmers and grazers moved in, did they build a lot of fences and shut down the hunting that you guys were doing?
It changed it. It was a whole new concept. We couldn't get into an area we usually went seasonally, and then we had to go someplace else, and that just created more conflict.
Though on a much smaller scale, and for only part of the year, the Plateau tribes of Oregon will carry on as long as there are roots and berries to gather and herds to hunt.
The lifestyle that we did have, it was thousands of years proven. This country here is only a couple hundred years old, and the struggles that are going on globally, we might end up going right back to what we still know.
So if everything goes to hell in a handbasket,
you
guys know that you're going to be okay.
We know what we have to do.
Well, I'm coming up here. I'm going to start walking to Oregon. I'll hang out with you. You'll adopt me? Can I hunt? I would suck at it.
Humans lived as hunter-gatherers for millennia. It wasn't that they lacked the knowledge or the skill to farm. They knew that if you planted a seed in the ground, it would grow. But they also understood that a mobile lifestyle allowed them a rich, healthy, and flexible way to adapt to their surroundings. So why did this change? New archaeological research into ancient bones may tell us. This is Tel Aviv University in Israel, home to the skeletal remains of some of the earliest humans in the Mediterranean. I've come here to find out how life in towns and cities affected people's health 7,000 to 9,000 years ago. Using high and low-tech methods, scientists can learn a lot from the bones of ancient settlers.
Some of the bones are showing burning signs. They are black. The skeletons were actually under the floor, so they were very close to the fire.
Israel Hershkovitz is a leading physical anthropologist. Human bone analysis is a vital part of his studies. Long bones, like arms and legs, reveal a lot about nutrition and disease. But just one small tooth can tell the life and death story of an ancient human being.
Teeth can tell you about everything.
They tell you about, as you said, diet, about general health, about growth and development, daily life, about occupation, because people are using their teeth as a tool, you know, not just for dietary purposes and so forth.
Dr. Hershkovitz has studied thousands of specimens from the late hunter-gatherer period called the Natufian and the first farmers of the early Neolithic. Through microscopic analysis and chemical testing, he's determined key differences between the two lifestyles. According to his study, Neolithic settlers, especially women, generally lived longer and less violent lives than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. So at first, it seems that living in a town was actually safer and easier. But life in permanent settlements came at a high price. More stress from repetitive physical labor like farming, and worse.
For example, you see there is over here what you call new bone formation. Okay, over here. It's a plaque of bone, like a carpet, a new bone carpeting the bone.
Okay.
This tells you right away this individual suffers from some kind of infectious disease, very likely tuberculosis. Once you are living within a contaminated environment and you live with the animals, with the newly domesticated animals, which brought a lot of diseases into the human population, this explains why such a high rate of inflammatory disease is found within the early farmer community.
Tuberculosis was only one of the new diseases connected to city life. Illnesses like measles, smallpox, influenza, cholera, malaria, and bubonic plague could spread like wildfire in a city.
If moving to permanent settlements meant more disease and for many a harder life, why did people do it? What was the benefit?
The best evidence to answer these questions comes from one of the very first cities in the world. This is the modern city of Jericho. Today, about 20,000 people live here in the Palestinian territory near the Dead Sea. Jericho is believed to be one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth, first established around 10,000 years ago, probably even before the first settlement at Çatalhöyük.
I'm climbing up on the oldest wall that we know of in history. It's over 9,000 years old, may even be older. And it doesn't look like much, but it goes down another meter, maybe another meter and a half. It's not just that. It's connected to this huge, round, monumental tower that has a staircase in the middle of it, probably the first staircase in all of human history. Most archaeologists think that a wall like this and a tower like this are built for defense.
In cities, there was something to defend: stored food supplies and all the fixtures of settled life. For the first time in history, there was something beyond yourself and your family to protect. Jericho was a vibrant, bustling Neolithic community. Archaeologists think that each household would have amassed things of value over the seasons: stockpiles of food like grains and oil, and crafted goods. And it all needed to be defended. Residents wove baskets, created textiles on a loom, or tanned animal hides into leather. Others ground grain and baked bread, among the most time-consuming and back-breaking tasks in the ancient household. Precisely because Jericho was a resource-rich community, the massive walls surrounding the city were probably built to protect these valuable commodities. When hunter-gatherers had trouble, they could quickly move on, but the new city dwellers didn't have that flexibility. They had to stand and fight. Avi Gopher specializes in the Neolithic Revolution.
The whole thing about agriculture is that you harvest and then you store it. While if you're a hunter and gatherer, usually you don't store anything.
Because you're always moving around. You're going to where your grains are, you're going to where the animals are.
It's part of the basic ethics of hunters-gatherers, not to store.
To share equally, to use
share equally and use immediate, with no delayed consumption. The minute you have it stored and some other peoples within the community or in other communities don't have enough, then politics go in.
And with politics inevitably come power struggles over the ownership of land, a concept rarely seen with hunter-gatherers.
For me, it's clear that when the Neolithic starts and you start harvesting fields that you've been sowing a few months earlier, then territoriality is becoming a major issue. This is the beginning of walls and wars and everything.
What was once shared suddenly becomes a source of competition, conflict, and war. And that wasn't the only source of trouble. Some people inevitably were better at producing and protecting surplus foods than others.
When people settled down, they began to amass wealth. This changed the entire social system, creating something else humans had never seen before: rich and poor. As villages became towns and towns became cities, the wealth and power of the emerging ruling class reached new heights.
And once that genie was out of the bottle, there was no putting it back. In early cities like Çatalhöyük, and probably also Jericho, there was little difference in size or luxury between houses. So it appears that there was no wealthy elite. But over thousands of years, as cities evolved, the idea of rich and poor and the gap between haves and have-nots became familiar and accepted all over the world.
This is the ancient city of Ephesus. Originally a Greek trading colony on the Turkish coast, it became part of the Roman Empire in the 2nd century BCE. It was a place for wealthy merchants, middle-class craftsmen, and dirt-poor slaves.
Ephesus was established by the Greeks in the 4th century BCE. Under the Romans, it grew to become a leading port on the Aegean Sea, with a population of over 500,000. It was clearly a stunning city, a metropolis with marble-paved streets and marketplaces, a beautiful library holding 12,000 scrolls, and an immense amphitheater seating more than 20,000 spectators. Ephesus had all the markers of a full-fledged modern city: monumental buildings, a diverse population, jobs that defined social status, and a ruling elite who lived in opulent homes like this.
I'm walking through ancient villas in the city of Ephesus, and this is amazingly well preserved. You've got mosaic floors, you've got wall paintings, atriums, fountains, all the kinds of things that the elites would have surrounded themselves with. You can see other rooms that would have been used for entertaining, rooms that have rich mosaics and beautiful wall paintings that just pop with color.
The divide between rich and poor in Ephesus is easy to see. That's because here, as in cities throughout the world, the rules had changed. The few had determined how to extract taxes and labor from the many, and they became rich doing it. There's evidence of this exploitative relationship everywhere in the ancient world, including at an amazingly well-preserved archaeological site in South America.
I'm on the Peruvian coast at an ancient site called Chanchan. From around the year 1000 to 1450, this was a sprawling city. At its height, over 30,000 people lived here, all part of a complex empire called the Chimu.
Chanchan was the center of imperial power, where Chimu kings ruled a vast empire. At the center of the city was a complex of imperial palaces surrounded by high walls. These separated the royal and elite classes physically and symbolically from the commoners. But the elite also depended on the commoners for the fruits of their labor. Craftsmen supplied them with fine tapestries, textiles, pottery, and finished metal goods. They delivered these extravagant goods to the palace, but as people of lower status, they were denied free access to the royal spaces within. What at first glance appears to be nothing more than a maze of decorative adobe walls is in fact a series of elaborate barriers designed to restrict entry to areas where Chanchan's riches were stored. Archaeologist Jason Toohey shows me the evidence of social inequality in this city.
Access to this area, because it's in the center of the plaza, would have been tightly controlled.
So we're at the center of it, and I notice there's all of these twisty-turny little passages. The walls would have been really high. It's hard to get into this space. You're controlling high-cost goods and making sure that people don't take it, and that you're doling out what goes where.
Absolutely. The empire went to great lengths to make accessing these inner areas of storage of high-quality goods very difficult. Movement inside what would have been very high walls would have been very controlled, very slow.
The Chimu believed that social status had been determined by creation itself. According to their myths, the sun god populated the earth with 3 eggs: gold for the ruling elite, silver for their wives, and copper for everyone else. Everyone else belonged outside the palace walls. Chanchan was a city of kings, but it must also have been a city of the desperately poor.
So we're outside the palace walls, and immediately I can see the difference in the architecture. This is the remains of a structure.
You can tell that this is architecture. Yeah, but it's nothing like, obviously, the palace. Yep. If we look around us, we can tell the rough outline of buildings, right? But there's absolutely nothing grandiose about what's out here.
Out here is where the coarse adobe homes and workshops of Chanchan's artisans once stood. This is a hallmark of ancient cities around the world. Most of their populations were controlled by an elite few. And it was a trap.
These people weren't living as well as those people, but what are they going to do? They're tied to this city, and there's really nowhere else for them to go.
Right. After a certain point, there are very few options for people to escape a system like this, in this case, extreme social separation, economic separation.
I think a lot of people looking at this might say, oh, well, you should just go out and be a hunter-gatherer again. There you have equal status.
Yeah.
But this isn't something that you can just go back out and do, because the memory's not there to remember how to hunt for yourself or to gather.
Right.
Regional empires like the Chimu developed in many parts of the New World, with the elite class believing it was invincible. But that was an illusion. Sometimes their power and reach could be surprisingly fragile. In the 16th century, Spanish explorers came upon an astounding sight in the jungles of southern Mexico: an abandoned city filled with magnificent stone structures. Pyramids, temples, and palaces. The local Maya people called the ruins Otulum, meaning land with strong houses. The Spanish name Palenque means fortification. Although the name evokes strength, Palenque, like most cities throughout history, was destined to fail.
Colossal stone temples like this one in Palenque, Mexico, were built by powerful kings who could muster the manpower and the resources of an entire region.
Those kings, along with a massive exploited workforce, transformed Palenque into a thriving city-state that flourished between the years 400 and 800. At the city's height, about 7,000 people were crammed into a small area. The kings continued to build more and more grand structures, broadcasting their right to rule. Recent mapping has identified nearly 1,500 buildings, and archaeologists say they've only unearthed a small fraction of the grand ceremonial city. For 5 centuries, the farmlands and jungles surrounding Palenque were able to provide enough food and resources for the city to grow and for its population to prosper. The location was good. Archaeologist Benito Venegas studies Palenque.
There's 5 rivers that cross Palenque, so you have enough water for human consumption. And in the north, you have a great wall. It's a cliff, and in the back, it's the mountains.
So it's naturally protected. It's
naturally
a safer
protected,
space.
yes.
But something went wrong. As in virtually every ancient city all over the world, the power structure collapsed and its buildings became ruins. Palenque was abandoned in less than 100 years. By 900, the jungle had begun to reclaim the grand city. What caused this apocalyptic fall?
For the construction of the temples, they begin to cut all the trees around Palenque.
The trees were used for fuel to make stucco for the massive stone buildings. 1 ton of stucco required burning 3 tons of timber. Wood was plentiful, but only for a while. When consumption outpaced supply, the jungle around Palenque disappeared. And without roots to hold it, the jungle's topsoil quickly eroded away.
And without trees, you don't have enough soil to make your maize, your beans grow well.
As competition for resources increased, Palenque saw its share of warfare. And there's also evidence of devastating drought in the 9th century. It's now believed that the ultimate death of this city, like ancient cities everywhere, was because it expanded beyond the limits of its natural resources. When a city grows too far, too fast, collapse is inevitable. Around the same time Palenque was falling, a city on the other side of the world was achieving prominence. Between the 9th and 15th centuries, the ancient city of Angkor in Cambodia was a vibrant, sprawling metropolis. Filled with magnificent temples, shrines, and palaces, as well as thousands of homes to accommodate a massive population. Angkor was the capital of the Khmer Empire, the largest and most powerful in Southeast Asia. Each new Khmer ruler expanded the city until it eventually covered over 1,000 square miles. It's the largest pre-industrial city ever discovered, larger than all 5 boroughs of New York City. Archaeologists attribute this remarkable growth to the city's highly sophisticated water system. In the year 2000, radar images from NASA revealed an intricate network of canals and reservoirs. This amazing feat of design and engineering captured water during the annual monsoon, then distributed it during the dry months for drinking and irrigation. The water system worked so well that Angkor continued to grow unchecked until the population had exceeded 1 million. Ironically, the elaborate waterworks that allowed Angkor to grow so big also probably led to its downfall. Over the centuries, it became harder and harder to maintain the colossal infrastructure. As the water system disintegrated, punishing droughts added to the crisis. The weakened city became increasingly vulnerable to invaders, who took full advantage. The causes of the collapse and abandonment of Angkor mirror those of Palenque and almost all other ancient cities. Overpopulation, unchecked growth, and the rapid depletion of resources eventually led these cities to fail. A grim lesson about the limitations of technology. Over the last 10,000 years, cities have grown from simple collections of mud brick houses to complex webs of concrete and steel. Our modern urban lifestyle seems unstoppable. But since the beginning of the Neolithic Revolution, countless cities have fallen under their own weight. These same challenges still plague every single city in the world today. As metropolitan populations continue to explode, crime, exploitation, and malnutrition still dominate the urban scene. Divisions between rich and poor were obvious in ancient cities like Ephesus or Chanchan. They're obvious in modern cities, too. It seems to be the nature of cities to bring people together in a big, crowded space, then split them up according to ethnicity, occupation, religion, and status. Jerusalem is one of these cities where a densely packed, divided population competes for limited resources. Nimrod Luz has studied these conflicts in Jerusalem for over 20 years.
This is the Christian quarter, and the Muslim quarter is here.
These distinct communities all live on top of each other, packed together.
This is the renovated Jewish quarter. And to finish the lookout, this is the small Armenian quarter. The space for actual living.
Nimrod believes the problems created by this close proximity are typical of city life everywhere.
It's overwhelming. I feel I wouldn't be able to figure my way around here. So not only do I feel lost, I'm confused because there's so many layers of religion and ethnicity and architecture.
I think the key word is overwhelming. There are people you don't talk to. There are communities you don't know how they work, where they shop. When different people don't mingle and they don't know how to react to each other, they opt for indifference.
Everything about social interaction is intensified in the pressure cooker of a city.
I'd say that the difference between pastoral communities and urban communities is what's at stake here. And in the urban communities, there's much more at stake. Things are much more complex, more elaborate.
More dug in.
More dug in, yeah.
Modern humans have been around for hundreds of thousands of years. But we didn't start living in cities until less than 10,000 years ago. Almost all of the cities of antiquity have fallen. New ones have replaced them. More cities, bigger cities. There's no end in sight. The urban problems of sanitation, disease, and water supply have been held in check by advances in medicine and engineering, allowing population numbers to explode. But are we on the brink of a new round of urban collapse? The Earth has never known a human population this large, close to 7 billion people, most of them living in cities. Clean drinking water is growing scarcer. Deadly infectious diseases are on the rise. The competition for oil, trees, and space has become fierce. Violence is increasing. Could city life be just a passing phase?
When it comes to